Good morning, everyone.
Good morning.
Thank you for joining us today. We will ask that anybody that is participating just remain on mute and off camera for the duration of the call. It will just help us to manage the recording and the session a bit tighter. At the end of the session, we'll have the opportunity for questions. And if at that point you want to come off mute and ask a question or come on camera and ask a question, that would be absolutely fine. Or feel free to use the chat box to do that as well. What might also be nice is if anybody wants to drop their name and where they're joining from in the chat as well. It'd be nice to see who's with us. Yeah, it's very, very sunny in Manchester, much to everybody's dismay.
Very sunny in London as well, as Jenny's just said. Not that I can tell because I'm sat in a box.
Yeah, and apologies in advance, everybody. I had a room set up for me to present from, but it is a sauna in there. So I'm now in the general office. So if there's any noise, please just bear with me. It was either that or a mess on camera for the next hour. Okay, well, shall we kick off? I think there are still a few people dripping through, but let's get started so that we can make sure that we've got time at the end as well.
Yeah, go for it.
Brilliant. So thank you again, everybody, for joining us today. We're going to be talking for the next hour or so about Pride Month, looking at what organizations should and should not be looking to achieve over the course of the month. Today, we're going to be looking at not necessarily the obvious answers like organizations shouldn't allow harassment or discrimination. We hope that by now, and with you being on this call, we're all aware of basic equity principles and employee rights. Instead, today, we're going to be looking at perhaps the unintended impact of some of the actions that we see organizations taking. And we're assuming in those instances that there's positive intent behind those actions. We'll be looking at how some actions and initiatives may be unintentionally causing harm to the LGBTQ plus community and the wider community, and how organizations can be cognizant of that. So just by way of introduction, my name is Kenya Peters. I'm the product marketing manager here at Culture Shift. Nearly said my old employer there, it's been years. And for context, so I identify as a queer woman or bisexual woman, and a note on language throughout the presentation will be referring to language such as queer as an umbrella term for LGBTQ plus people. We will also be interchanging between LGBTQ, LGBT, and LGBTI, but when those moments come up, I'll be sure to explain as to why. I have experience and a background in activism and supporting organizations in managing culture around the LGBT community in different workplaces. And I'm joined today by my colleague, Vicki. And Vicki, I'll let you introduce yourself.
Yeah, thanks, Kenya. So my name is Vicki Baars. I use she, they pronouns. I identify as queer, both in my sexuality and in my gender identity. I identify as genderqueer. I align with the term woman, which is why I'm quite happy to still use she, her pronouns. But I don't acknowledge that my gender identity sits in the same sphere as many cis women. And my experience, so I, many moons ago, was the NUS LGBT officer, which meant I represented all of the different LGBT students from across the UK. And subsequently since then, I've been sort of the LGBTQ plus rep in various organisations, sat on various staff development groups, and supported people as an EDI professional in that capacity as well, in organisations working towards LGBTQ plus equity. in various different universities mostly. So, and I am the head of cultural transformation at Culture Shift, which means I get to work with all of our different partner organisations. Oh, someone's just turned the light on in my room for me. That's very helpful. Didn't know there was a switch for that. I'm in a new co-working space, so I'm definitely just learning about it. But I'm all lit up now. And yeah, so I get to work with our partner organisations, helping them to excel in using our reporting platform and thinking about all of the policies, processes, campaigns that surround that work as well. So yeah, really excited to be having this conversation today. Thanks, Kenya.
Awesome, thanks, Vicky. Far more experienced in LGBT inclusion in the workplace than the electrics of your new office. Brilliant. So as I mentioned, today we're going to be talking about Pride and the LGBTQ+ community. We'll be talking about what organizations should be taking in terms of action, and also given the current political and social landscape, what we should be avoiding. But to understand why the discussion is important right now. Oh, sorry. There's just a couple of people that aren't on mute. Could I ask one of the organizers to mute any There we go. Yeah, sorry. So to understand, I suppose, why the discussion is important right now, we wanted to make sure we first took a look back at where and why Pride began, where we were then and where we are now. So we'll go back to 1969. In the UK at that time, homosexual acts between two consenting male adults that were aged 21 and over had been legalized in the 1967 Sexual Offences Act. There was a lot of social backlash to this that continued to make it difficult for LGBT+ Britons to exist peacefully and free from harm, but there was some progress in terms of legislation. Now, at the same time in the USA, legal restrictions on homosexuality were growing. At that point in time in the States, there was a huge concern of the threat of foreign nations, particularly the Soviet Union, in a time that we are probably all aware of called the Cold War. And what that led to in America was this growing paranoia and this deep trust in anything that was anti-American, anything that deviated from the American norm, and homosexuality being a big part of that. It was seen as being something being upheld as one of those things that Americans needed to be concerned about as a threat to their national security. So that's just a bit of the political and social background at the time. So at that point in time, cross-dressing was illegal. In New York, many gay men and gender non-conforming people would find safe haven in bars, particularly within an area of downtown Manhattan called the Greenwich Village, at bars, and those bars were often operated by the mafia. So in the early hours of June 28th, 1969, police executed an unplanned raid in the early hours of the morning at the Stonewall Inn. It was a tiny little pub where lesbians, gay men, as well as a lot of gender non-conforming, cross-dressing people were socializing and dancing. And they raided at an unplanned hour. And during that raid, there were reports of sexual assault on some of the patrons of the bar that night, as officers held in anybody that they deemed to be dressed in a way that didn't align with their sex. Now, the accounts of what happened there are shaky and mismatched, but I think what's generally agreed is that the treatment of LGBT people at that time and in that bar was consistent with the mistreatment that they were experiencing overall. And it sparked a lot of anger, and that anger led on to 5 days of riots and protests against the behavior of the officers that night, as well as the ongoing mistreatment, abuse, and harassment of LGBTQ+ people across the city and across the nation. So during this time period, there were a whole host of well-known activists, queer activists in New York who began to organize in that time. One of whom was Sylvia Rivera, who was a prominent activist for gay liberation, and subsequently her work went on to activism for transgender rights. And Sylvia gave an incredibly powerful speech where she spoke about the treatment she and many other queer people in Manhattan had endured, from rape and sexual assault to job loss, physical violence, and home evictions. a speech which we won't play to you today, but you can find on YouTube by typing Sylvia Rivera and the words here on the screen. It's incredibly emotional and it's difficult to hear, so I will offer up some content warnings, but it paints an important picture of the struggle of LGBT people at that point in time. So that was in 1969, 54 years ago this month. In this first picture, you have an image of Sylvia Rivera and Marsha P. Johnson, another prominent transgender activist from the same time in the streets of New York. The story of Stonewall was incredibly interesting, and I've barely given you a headline as to what was happening there and what happened over that time period. So I do encourage you all to read up on that in your own time. We can share resources on that after the call as well. And as I mentioned, the history of it is conflated with mistruths about what actually happened, how violence was initiated, and so on. But what we want you to take away is that these riots and the events that happened in the final week of June paved the way for LGBT people to begin standing up and fighting for their safety and their freedom and their equality in a way that had never been done before. So then 3 years later, in 1972, the first UK Pride was staged in London. And as I mentioned previously, in the UK, homosexual acts had been legalized at that time, but it was the age of consent that wasn't equal to heterosexual relationships that queer people or LGBT people agreed at that time that they wanted to challenge. That, as well as the treatment of LGBT people had not progressing, led, I think, between 300 and 500, again, shaky accounts, of people taking to the streets of London and marching. Again, public perceptions were still incredibly negative of LGBT people. They were still at risk of violence, of ostracization, and mistreatment in near all areas of their life. So the law might have been slightly more progressive, but the reality for LGBT people in the UK at that time was still incredibly bleak. And so they marched and they protested, and accounts of the day were that the atmosphere was in good spirits and good humor, but the cause for fighting was as real as ever. So we then fast forward 15 years to Margaret Thatcher's government, to the HIV and AIDS outbreak, and that having a huge impact on public perceptions of the LGBT community, and in particular of gay men. And if you've not seen the Channel 4 drama, It's a Sin, then I recommend you get that on your watch list. It's an incredible show. Although painful, it's a beautiful reenactment of events at that time and the fear and the panic that grew towards gay men in the 80s as a result of the spread of the virus. It also highlights in quite well the lack of action from the Conservative government and how it was used as a tool, I suppose, to promote political action at that time. And Margaret Thatcher was very much used this narrative and used this fear to drive forward her political agenda at the time, or the Conservative Party's political agenda at the time. In 1987, the government passed Section 28 of the Local Government Bill, which banned local authorities and schools from promoting homosexuality, from funding learning materials that promoted homosexuality, and just in general from allowing teachers to promote it or even discuss it in their teachings. And it marked, I suppose, this huge regression in any of the progress that had been seen in LGBT equity in previous years. And it sent LGBT people across the nation back into repressing their sexuality, back into fear and of being, I suppose, outed or harmed in some way. Now, Section 28 remained in law for 15 years, up until 2003. And even at that time, as it was being removed from legislation, there was backlash to the clause being removed, and campaigns such as Keep the Clause, as you can see here. And what we have, I suppose, is a story that matches progress with setbacks and equality with backlash, but a community of people that remain steadfast in their pursuit of equality in political, economic, and social terms combined. But it's important to note that the fight has carried us a long way. LGBTQ people are now protected by the Equality Act. Same-sex marriage has been legalized, as well as more equalities in adoption and parenting rights. In politics, we have more and more LGBTQ plus representation than ever before. Manchester, where we're based at Culture Shift, elected our first ever openly trans representative into the post as Liberal Democrat representative in Ancoats, something we're incredibly proud of, given Chris Northwood was a former Culture Shifter, former member of our team. And then in sport, Jake Daniels, who plays for Blackpool FC, recently came out as the first openly gay professional footballer, demonstrating minimal, admittedly, but growing progress in sport representation. And there are countless examples of queer representation of TV and film, notably also in young adult TV and film. And with some of that language that you saw previously on the Keep the Clause promotion, it said along the top, protect our children. Representation in young adult TV and film is incredibly important in helping to break down and stop those narratives from persevering. But as we've shown along the journey so far in LGBT equity, progress is only ever met with backlash and regression, because in reality, this year, the UK was ranked 15th in the ILGA's Rainbow Map, which ranks countries across Europe on the legal, political, and human rights situation of LGBTQ plus people in Europe. Being 15th means that in the past 8 years, the UK has dropped 14 places. And I think for a lot of people, when you think about Pride, it looks a lot like that previous slide. It's celebration, how far the LGBT community have come. It's the parades, it's the dancing, it's drag queens putting on shows outside of bars. It's all of this joy and happiness, which it should be and there is a place for, but we need to remain cognizant of the reality that LGBT rights are at risk. And this map is a headline and it made headlines. And it's easy not to understand the weight of it without looking at the detail. So of course, I'll go on to talk about the detail now. And I've got 6 points here that kind of just try to encapsulate some of the reality of what it's like to be LGBT in the UK today. And something that I'll always recommend is, data is great because it tells a story, but as individuals, we should be going out and listening to the stories of LGBTQ people. That doesn't necessarily mean asking your lesbian friend if they're not comfortable sharing their experience, but there are plenty of artists and speakers on the internet and in different spaces that you can look to for those stories, for understanding that reality better. But I'll jump into the numbers. So LGBT people are at an increased risk of harm through crime. Homophobic hate crimes have doubled in 5 years, with 26,824 reported in the year 2021 to 2022, which, as you can see, shot up significantly from 10,000 in the year 16-17. The rights of trans people are under attack consistently. 72% of trans people reported experiencing transphobia when accessing goods or services. Conversations on trans people are being disproportionately covered in the media. We're in a place right now where we have this data on LGBT representation across the UK for the first time ever. Transgender people make up 0.24% of the British population, and that's based on the data taken from the latest census, where we asked 97% of households responded to that census. And yet the trans community consistently make headlines. They drastically over-index in the number of headlines compared to the size of the population. And this isn't because trans people are consistently doing headline-worthy things. It's mostly based on just the existence of trans people, their existence being debated, rejected, or attacked. 85% of trans people said that transphobic rhetoric in the media. Sorry, my headphones disconnected for a second. 85% of trans people said that transphobic rhetoric in the media had impacted how people in their family were treating them, and similarly, high numbers for friends and employees. And the consequence this is having is severe, because LGBTQ plus people are at a higher risk of needing mental health support from the NHS and privately, or being at risk of dying by suicide. 68% of LGBT plus young people had experienced suicidal thoughts, and that's compared to 29% of young people who were not LGBT plus. And all of this, it's how people are perceiving the LGBTQ plus people and how LGBTQ plus people are feeling in response. But this is intrinsically linked to how the community are treated and represented in politics. And if you look over to the States at the Don't Say Gay bill in Florida, it's incredibly reminiscent of the Section 28 clause that was passed in 1987. And here in the UK, having upheld conversion therapy law for so long until quite recently, and yet still failing to make sure that that change in law protected everybody under the LGBT umbrella, we can see that politically we still have a long way to go. And LGBT activists have repeatedly pointed out how queer people are set out to disproportionately be impacted by changes to law, such as in the policing bill. And then finally, we see how this is playing out in the workplace. So if you look at that story of how LGBT people, and particularly trans people, are represented in the media, how they're experiencing their day-to-day life and accessing goods and services, only 4% of UK employers feel that their workplace is liberal enough to tolerate transgender workers. And what really gets me is that last word of tolerate. I give a lot of talks on inclusion in the workplace, and when I'm talking about any other characteristic, whether that's race, ability, age, sexuality, parental status, when we're talking about those characteristics, it's about belonging and it's about celebration and embracing people for their diversity. But the battle is so much more uphill for the most marginalized amongst us, that even to be tolerated is the goal that we want to strive towards. So again, this is the data and it paints a picture of where we are now. This last stat really talks about workplace, and we want to go on to that a bit more to really make it relevant to the work that you're doing day in, day out. So think back to the birth of Pride in 1969. It was a huge step forward for LGBT visibility and progress against a backdrop of huge political tension and social animosity against the LGBT community. Again, the steps forward for the community with the legislation of homosexual acts and the removal of homosexuality as a mental health illness in the UK, shortly followed by Section 28 and the vitriol against gay men and with the HIV and AIDS pandemic. The point being of all of this is that where we are right now, we're seeing another repetition of that same historical cycle. And it's important, yes, that we continue to celebrate LGBT communities and colleagues, but as individuals and organizations, it's vital that we also remain aware of the struggles being faced by LGBT people right now and use the power and influence we have to truly challenge injustice and inequity in the systems around us. And organizations have a huge role to play in that, whether it's as employers, as influencers of social perceptions, or as financial powers. Organizations have the ability to directly impact the mobility of LGBTQ+ people. Internally, how LGBTQ+ people are considered in the hiring process, how they're supported culturally, and how policies and processes are crafted with the LGBT community in mind has real impact and bearing on the treatment and perceptions of your employees. The training and education initiated by employees has an impact on the way all of your employees think about LGBT inclusion, and that has real bearings on the world. Equally, through marketing and comms and the actions of brands, organizations have the ability to influence the way society thinks and feels about different issues. If you think about, say, the Dove campaign and how that's contributed to our changing perceptions of female body empowerment, or maybe less obviously, brands like Red Nose Day or political campaigns, things like that, that influence how we think and feel and respond to different important topics. And then there's financial powers, so where a business is putting their money, whether that's through contracts, partnerships, donations to other institutions. Of course, politics is very important in that, but think more locally around what contractors you're spending money on and are they aligned to your LGBT policies. And all of that's important because what we see and what's most prominent and visible when we look at brands and their representation of the LGBT community is what you put online, what you put on social media, what you show through your brands and your products. And I want to talk a little bit about the topic of rainbow washing, which you'll all be aware of, but that's where organizations use LGBTQ+ symbolism and language to insinuate a misleading level of corporate allyship. As I mentioned on the slide before, brands and marketing have a role to play in supporting Pride, and this is certainly one of the mechanisms by which to do so. The issue comes when there's nothing behind the rainbow. So let's look at a recent example of that in Bud Light and Dylan Mulvaney. Dylan's a popular social media influencer who has very publicly shared elements of her transition journey into living as a woman on social media channels, most notably on TikTok. And she was asked to participate in a sponsored post with Bud Light. And that was met with a huge amount of backlash from anti-trans protesters online, on social media, from Baars who destocked the brand, and from public figures, the most notable of which being Kid Rock, who's a singer-songwriter who publicly protested the brand by shooting cans of Bud Light with a gun on video and then posting that online. The backlash led to Bud Light then stepping back from Dylan and the partnership with her, publicly stating that they never intended to be a part of a discussion that divides people. And for many businesses, being part of a divisive conversation might not be what they're wanting to do. It might not be something that they're comfortable with. And many organizations are justified in avoiding creating content that might add to a narrative that they're not comfortable speaking up on. However, in Bud Light actively engaging a trans influencer and then backing down once it caused controversy, it just highlights the issues of brands attempting to profit off of diverse talent without truly investing into or supporting diverse issues. And then on the contrary to that, or in contrast to that, brands can and do have the ability to engage in conversation authentically when they have the strategy, the voice, and the knowledge on how to do so properly. When they lead with authenticity and don't simply tokenize the community of LGBT people around them. So this is an example from Innocent Drinks, who proactively noticed that one of the people that they were following were tweeting statements that contradicted their own policies around culture and inclusion. When you look deeper at the work that Innocent do, they have clear internal policies on inclusion and diversity. They report on their inclusion data. And although I couldn't see their kind of most recent report, they did have reports on there of their DEI targets and attainment and the work that they were doing internally. And all of that work only empowers them to be able to take action like this and to be able to demonstrate publicly their corporate allyship and then not be in a place where they need to back down if and when they're challenged on that. And that's the key, really. It's ensuring that before you start to communicate outwardly, you're laying the foundations and doing the work that needs to be done internally. And the reason for that is because people notice when you don't. When we start to look at Gen Z, they're becoming more powerful in terms of their buying power and more powerful in terms of their place and their entrance into the workplace. And they're interrogating brands more than any generation did before them. So not only is corporate allyship important to the newest generation of consumers and employees, but they won't settle for anything less than genuine authenticity. And with 1 in 6 Gen Zers identifying as LGBTQ+, the spotlight is really closely on brands that publicly present as LGBTQ+ allies. In fact, 78% of Gen Zers in one study said that they believe brands are all talk and no action, and that they say things that they don't mean. So there's a job to do in actively proving to the community and to the wider public that your external demonstrations of corporate allyship are backed up by a robust internal system of support and strategy for LGBTQ+ people. Now, I'm going to take a break from the slides for a bit and bring Vicki into the conversation. Thank you for sitting so patiently there, Vicki, whilst I work through those slides.
Really interesting.
What we're going to do next is go into a bit of a conversation on what I've been talking about so far. So I think hopefully one of the key takeaways is talking publicly about your corporate allyship as a brand is great so long as you have the goods to back it up. And we want this session to be as practical as possible. So now we're just going to walk through what we think are the 4 key areas that organizations need to be looking at when it comes to developing that robust framework of LGBT support in the workplace. So the first of which is policy. And Vicki, I'm going to ask you a few questions to kind of expand on that a bit more, if that's okay. So would you mind talking to me a bit about how organizational and employee policies are the foundations of an effective LGBTQ plus strategy in any workplace?
Yeah, absolutely. I think, like, as you said, Kenya, you can't just have marketing campaigns that are during Pride Month or during LGBT History Month. We have to have like underpinning principles within policy, within organizations that actually support and protect LGBTQ plus individuals. And so, you know, practical examples of that might be fertility policy, adoption, parental leave, making sure that those are inclusive of LGBTQ plus people's needs. And couples going through IVF, for example, like, can they get sufficient time off for all of those medical appointments? If parents have adopted and they are same-sex parents, like, how are they able to share that leave if they are in separate organizations? We've luckily got a really well, not luckily, by design, actually, I've got a very generous parental leave for secondary parents. So rather than having it written that it's paternity leave for a father, like thinking about who a second parent might be, they could be another woman, or they could be a trans person. Similarly, your maternity policies, thinking about the fact that, and I remember one day having this conversation with an individual who was a lawyer in a large organization, who had heard that we were starting to change our language around our maternity policy, and you couldn't say the word mother anymore. And it was a really interesting conversation because she had never realized that that trans men can be pregnant and have children. And even though we're talking about a very small number of the population who are trans men, and an even smaller number who choose to have their own children biologically, it can happen. And so making sure that it's not about excluding women from these policies. Those policies are, like, you know, 99% about women's experiences, and we should absolutely acknowledge that. But it's also thinking about that one trans man that might be in your organization who's thinking about becoming pregnant, and how those policies relate to him. Thinking about transition policies as well in that vein. So how does your employer support you as individuals, also any of your like service users or clients, depending on the kind of organization you are. How are you providing those people with technical and practical support, like changing their name in systems? Again, medical leave being quite an important one for a lot of people transitioning, but not everyone, I should say, not everyone goes through a medical transition. So certainly the sort of practical support around how might you inform an individual that you're using a new name or a new pronoun, and what are those communication channels, are really important things to have written down in practical policies and procedures.
Yeah, that's really interesting. That anecdote you gave there around the conversation with the lawyer is really interesting to me, because I think we almost fall back on, well, they're a lawyer, they're an expert, they will have all bases covered. And that's not always the case, because not all lawyers will be experts in managing LGBT inclusion in law and policy, and the law's not perfect.
Yeah.
Right.
Building regulation real well. That's a heritage, and remember that you do need to share those stories with individuals and not make assumptions on people's understanding or knowledge of people's lived experiences.
Right, and it comes back to that idea of collaboration and including people in your planning before you go into execution, which I'm sure we'll come onto at some point. So you mentioned there around kind of fertility, adoption, parental leave policies. What are the, I suppose, basic fundamental strategies that people on this call should be thinking, let me go and check that, let me make sure I've got that?
Yeah, I think it's looking at the range of from like individual experiences right through to organizational kind of practices, thinking about, have you done your work around engaging with individuals about their experiences and understood them, because before you can write policy that relates to individuals' lived experiences, you need to understand what they are first. So that might be speaking to the people who are within your organization, or if those people don't exist within your organization, if there aren't, say, LGBTQ plus staff networks or pre-existing research, or people that you know are going to openly be able to talk about these things, looking to organizations that do have that information about lived experiences of employees. So really doing the research and groundwork to start with. Then it's about sort of testing those ideas that you have, making sure they practically work. Like I've seen organizations fall down where they've had really ambitious plans and then they don't work practically with their systems and processes, for example. So testing those things around against your systems and processes as well, and actually, speaking to your IT team and going, if we say we'll change someone's name in the system, can we actually do it? Like just checking the practicalities. And then there's also like setting ambition and target, right? So having your data is really important, knowing who is in your organization. And it's okay at the beginning, I think, to set arbitrary targets and to say, this is where we want to be, and then refining that as you find more about the realities of that you're trying to build these strategies within. And then like telling people about it and being transparent and accountable for it as well, I think is a really important next step in your strategy.
Yeah, I agree. So it's Pride Month now, and I haven't spoken to people who are doing this work, diversity and inclusion professionals across different organizations. I know one of the things that comes up at this point in time is reviewing those policies. So how often do you think organizations should be reviewing their policies or looking to create new policies if they don't exist at the moment?
If they don't exist at the moment, I think that's like a priority to get those ducks in order and to look to other organizations that maybe of a similar size, a similar field that you're in, and see what kind of policies and practices they have in place. I would say it's good governance to be reviewing policies every 3 to 5 years, depending on the capacity within your organization. And that doesn't mean you have to entirely rewrite it from scratch. That might be just updating and editing an already existing policy. You may also need to make changes whenever there's large sort of more social change that's going on, or regulatory change that might be happening in your sector as well. So those are considerations, and they might not fit in perfectly with your governance cycle of every 3 to 5 years. So you might need to, reconsider whether that policy is still relevant, whether there's any like updates or changes. And it's also really important to know how you change policy in your organization, right? So for some people that might go just straight through your executive board and it might be like quite quick and simple. For others, there might be a bit more of a bureaucratic process. So you might need to go through like certain committees, through negotiations with your trade unions, through wider consultation with anyone who's a stakeholder or who's impacted by it. So it's making sure that you understand like the timeline of change for your policy as well.
Perfect. There are questions coming through in the chat, so I'm just aware of time. I'm going to try and move on to culture and talking a little bit around culture and how that differs from policy, so we could talk about policy forever, but just aware of time. So from your perspective, where does policy and culture differ?
So ideally they shouldn't, but the reality is they do. In an ideal world, your policies should be written in a way that your culture can reflect, and that's the aim, right? Most organizations aren't there. Most organizations have set ambitions in policy and say this is where we want to be and this is where we're getting to, and being honest about that discrepancy between where your culture is already at, and by culture I mean the day-to-day behaviors that people exhibit and the way in which individuals interact and the way that socially creates an environment for people to exist in, and how that maps on against policy, which is where you write how you want your organization to be, what you want to happen if something goes wrong. And so ideally those things should be like as close to each other as possible, and this should resolve any problems in this. But in reality, they can be a bit far apart. I think that to me is the difference.
And you spoke a bit around like what is the reality, what is the day-to-day? So how can organizations take stock and understand what that culture is? How do they get to know what that reality is?
Well, I think that's through employee engagement, through user engagement, depending on, again, type of organization you are. And so that might be through talking to your staff networks, doing research through surveys, whether that's like a once a year survey or pulse surveys, or, you know, having something like an all year round reporting tool like we have at Culture Shift, that gives you kind of data and feedback about individuals' experiences, something you can understand and digest and iterate on depending on what the challenges are and the issues are that are coming up in that information. If you are a very resource-strapped organisation, some of that information is more widely available, as you said, like for census, that's given us a sense of like the kind of population data that we didn't have before, which is really exciting. First time we're collecting that, and even though it's like a bit dry, I would say, in terms of data, it's still a monumental moment to have population data across the entirety of the UK, and it really does help with that sort of thing, to like have your baseline data and information and start to like unearth people's experiences as a result of that. That will help you to understand the changes you need to put in place.
Perfect. And I want to weave in a question from the audience here, which is, can you use policy to change culture? Which I think is incredibly interesting.
Yeah, absolutely. I think as a bit of a policy geek, like I'm really keen on thinking about policy as ambition, and thinking about how you set a cultural tone for an organisation, it being the bar that you're aiming for. And so yeah, I would very much encourage people to utilise policy in culture change. However, I would say that that has to be communicated well to individuals. There's no point in writing a policy that no one reads, like a 60-page document that like is just kind of gathering dust. How do you bring that to life? How do you make that into like a quick read article that you send to people? How do you put that into expectation setting when you're doing inductions with new staff, or when you're doing training with people who've been there for a while, or when you're doing like performance reviews? Like, how are these things weaved into the organization? So whatever you're setting within policy, whatever ambitions you have for culture change, are woven in the interaction points where you are saying to people like, this is how we want to exist as an organization, this is what we're aiming for.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. I like to think of it, I play sports, so I like to think of it as you know, we write down the rules and the players aren't looking at the rules day in, day out. They're not looking at the rules and studying them. They're learning how to play the game. They're going onto a team and learning how that team plays and how you work with people on the team, and how you challenge yourself and change the team, and how you play and how you go out and win games. And the rules are there so that when we, you know, break one, we can go back and say, we did write that down. We're not meeting the expectations of this game right now, but it shouldn't directly impact what you're doing on a day-to-day basis. And I'm very proud of myself for getting a sports analogy into a webinar. So let's talk about that strategy a little bit. What are the, I guess, some of the fundamental things that we should be remembering when building an LGBTQ plus inclusion strategy?
I think first and foremost is not to just include the obvious issues, to really think about who are the more marginalised individuals and groups within your organisation. Are there voices you aren't hearing? Thinking about intersectionality, so people who have potentially like multiple lived experiences that may be impacting them. So for example, like, are your like queer women of colour having a different experience to your white gay men in your organization, and how do you find out if those experiences are different and what like needs those particular individuals might have due to those different compounding factors of potentially experiencing maybe, you know, bi-erasure and racism at the same time. And so, yeah, I think that's quite important. I think in terms of looking longer term as well, I think strategies should be about where do we want to go and mapping a journey. I think in terms of successful strategic implementation, role modeling and leadership are really key. Like, are the people who are heading up your organization, you know, demonstrating the actions that you want everyone else to be taking as well? Are they talking about the policies? Are they giving people the time off that they want? Are they, you know, like taking part in the celebratory activities that the marketing team are putting together? Are they actually, you know, comfortable talking about queer lived experiences, because that can sometimes really show, oh, it's Pride Month and we're going to talk about that now. Like, you know, I think none of that stiffness that we see sometimes from leaders, and actually, like, you know, getting them comfortable in understanding the lived experiences of people and being able to articulate those. There's also some of the like core areas that need to be in every strategy as well, right? So thinking about recruitment, and once you've recruited people, how they feel comfortable in the organization. We've talked about it as a sense of belonging, but you know, what activities are taking place and what conversations are taking place and what protections do they have that make them go, yeah, this is somewhere I can thrive. And then also around progression and thinking about like, how do we make sure that there aren't limitations on people's progression within our strategic plans as well.
Yeah, and then how do you give people the safety to speak up when they think that is an issue, whether that be, you know, I don't feel like I'm progressing in the workplace because of who I am, or when our CEO gave that talk on LGBT equality, it looked like they wanted to be anywhere else. How do you give people the safety to speak up about those things?
Yeah.
And then I just wanted to, you touched on kind of, you know, how are your senior leaders exemplifying the culture that you want to embed within the organization, but you also need to think about how that filters down. You see a lot of examples of kind of executive and senior leadership and C-suite being incredibly supportive of LGBT and inclusion initiatives in general. And where that starts to falter is as you move down to your middle management and how they're upholding your culture and strategy, and direct channels of communication, direct channels of feedback, how you build inclusion KPIs into individual performance. All of those things need to be considered at multiple levels across the organization in order for a culture to really take hold.
Yeah. Your sports analogy there, Kenya, on that, I think you know, your players aren't thinking about the rules day in, day out. They're thinking about strategy. They're thinking about being strong enough and fit enough to do that thing. And like, if you know, if you think about that as an employee, but the people who should be reading your rules are your referees. And if we liken them to, say, your manager, the people who are, you know, coordinating and leading the organization, holding that, like, you know, group of people, those people should be really familiar with your organizational policies. They should be able to regurgitate them, because they're the ones who are helping to enact them and guide individuals. So I think, like, yeah, that layer of sort of people who have line management responsibility and can be, like you say, the kind of the missing point sometimes. That, you know, it's those people who actually should be really comfortable with reading those playbooks, those rules, those policies,
Yeah,
to reiterate them to individuals.
Yeah, absolutely. I feel a LinkedIn post brewing here, Vicky. Right.
Everyone, we are both sportos, so apologies. Gone down this route.
So how do you measure that? How do you measure success of a strategy?
Well, we talked a bit about data earlier, so having an understanding of people's lived experiences, looking at things like you know, asking questions in your staff survey around bullying and harassment. We actually at Culture Shift believe in increased numbers of reports being a positive thing, especially if you've only recently got an all year round reporting tool. Seeing those numbers going up is a really positive narrative, and it shows that people are trusting the organisation to tell them. Ultimately, longer term, you might want to see them plateau and drop off. But if you've never been regularly asking people to speak up about difficult experiences they've been having, then yeah, we see it as a positive. So yeah, it's about like kind of looking at data and benchmarking against that with other organizations if you can find that information as well. So different sectors will have different abilities to benchmark against one another. But yeah, data and analysis and review and evaluation, and asking those individual employees that you went to about how they wanted policies to look and feel to meet their lived experiences. Is it working? Is it, you know, are we successfully doing the things that we said we would do, and testing that with them?
Yeah, absolutely. Now we've got about 10 minutes left, so I wanted to go on to some of the audience questions, if that's okay.
Yes, please do.
So one of them is, Actually, the first question, I hope that we've answered this to just quite some extent at the moment, but I just wonder if there's anything more that you wanted to add. It's how can companies embed inclusivity and acceptance all year round rather than just through Pride Month? I'm very conscious a lot of companies may host a wide range of activities throughout June, but then the conversations fall flat throughout the rest of the year. And I know in our conversation, in our conversations before and prior to this webinar, you've spoken about, you know, dialing up efforts in those key points in time. And I wonder if you want to just talk on that a little bit.
Yeah, so I think that like dates like Pride Month are great for signal boosting, but they cannot be the only time you are talking about these things. And like I said, I think it's key points in people's like employee life cycle. So you know, are you talking about them in induction? Are you continuing to talk about these things during performance review, or however you do kind of organizational feedback, whether that's 360 reviews or you know, development reviews or whatever they might look like? Are you having these conversations during promotions, and are, you know, helping to support like inclusivity in your organization? Is that embedded in those organizational practices throughout the year? Like, it's nice to have events at other times of year as well, and I would encourage that, but I think fundamentally it's about making sure that people's like day-to-day experiences at work are upheld and supported, yeah, throughout the year.
Brilliant. There's another question here on remunerating staff, I suppose. Amber said that she is conscious of how much unpaid labor LGBT plus staff do in affecting change in their organizations. So how do we draw those boundaries between wanting to make our companies more inclusive, but not taking on the work others should be doing because they don't want to do the work?
Yeah, I think this is about your workload models in your organization. I've come from organizations where there are very clear organizational workload models where any volunteering that you do within staff networks is considered part of your daily workload rather than additional work that you're doing outside of hours. So I think those conversations need to be had with managers and leaders, with any ED&I professionals who are organizing those networks, and yeah, get people getting time off in lieu, or people getting time back, it being recognized within promotion schedules, it being yeah, like potentially remunerated, but I don't think it's the only option, and I think that can be a little bit limiting for some organizations sometimes. But I also, if you do have the money and you can remunerate individuals for this work, like do. I'm like absolutely saying don't, but I think for like it can't be the only answer because not everyone's budget can stretch to that. But certainly we should be taking precautions to make sure that individuals aren't putting in loads of additional hours that they aren't either like getting back in time in lieu or recognized for.
Yeah. I am very conscious of the fact that I thought this webinar was running until 12 and it was running until 11:45. So I will start to wrap up here. Sorry to everybody that we've kept on for longer. And thank you for bearing with us whilst we've spoken for an extra 10 minutes or so. Your last answer was incredibly important there, Vicki. I also think it's important for organizations to recognize what their capacity is, and being honest, if they're saying, you know, we only have the capacity to do so much and we don't want to be burdening our employees with extra work if they're not capable or able to do so, and therefore these are the only things that we can achieve this year. But just making sure that they have that plan and that communication to say, and these are the things that we think we can achieve in this time frame, and making sure that those are still achieved with the resource that they have. I'm sure there are more questions in the chat. We have some follow-up slides that we'll share that just kind of summarize some of the key points that we've touched on today, that Vicki's touched on in their responses. Thank you so much for your questions in. Anything that wasn't answered, or if you had additional questions, please put those in the chat now. We'll make sure that we respond to you via email or to everybody that was in attendance. And again, yeah, thank you so much for your time, everybody.
Yeah, thanks.
And happy Pride Month.
Happy Pride Month.